friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the brand new Sabrina and Spooky Text stamp sets from Hello Bluebird. So I have stamped those images out on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm starting with her skin, and I wanted to do a little bit of a medium skin tone, so I went with E00, E11, and E13. I'll use that E13 to lay in some shadow up under her hairline and on her neck right below her head, and also on her one hand that is showing. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E11. And then I'll use that E00 to fill in any remaining space. And I did do a second layer on that to deepen up the saturation. I'll add in R20 for her cheeks to give them a little rosy glow. And I also added that to my kitty and my bats while I was at it. For her hair, I wanted to do a bit of a reddish brown, something similar to my own hair color. So I went with E13, E15, E17, and E18. Hair is the one thing that I color a bit differently than everything else. I typically color everything darkest to lightest, but when I'm doing hair, I usually start with the lightest shade. That's just because it's not something that I do a lot, and I can be heavy-handed with my darker colors. So I just like to build up that color and make sure that I have room for some nice highlights in there so it doesn't get too dark and we lose all that beautiful texture. So I started with the E13, laid in my shadows where they are eventually going to go with my darkest shades, and then I'm coloring right over them progressively as I go darker and darker. I added in the E15 and then the E17, and I will go up to the E18 as well. And then once I have that, I'm going to start blending back out in reverse with the E17 next, just taking that color up a little bit further, still leaving plenty of white space for those lighter shades. I'll use that E15 next and just fill that in a little bit farther, adding also some shadows up under the hat over on the part where it's drooped over her right eye. And then I'm going to fill in any remaining white space with that E13. So once I have that, I usually like to assess and go back with a little bit of my darkest shades to just emphasize those low lights in the hair. So I'm going to go back to that darkest shade, that E18, and add a bit extra of that where I want those deepest shadows to be, wherever the hair is kind of pinched together in her braid or tucked behind her ear. And then I'm ready to move on, and I'm going to do her dress and her little hat. I wanted them to be black, so I'm using the toner grays for that, T3, T5, T7, and T9. That T9 is very, very dark, so it looks quite black without... I don't know, I feel like the black sometimes just doesn't have much personality to it because it's so dark. So I typically like to use the 9 of whatever gray that I'm using in place of black. And I think it does a good job of reading as black. So I'm using that T9 to lay in some shadows, and I wanted to also create some movement in her dress because she's got it kind of bunched up as she's sitting on her little broomstick, and there's some ruffles in that fabric. So wherever the fabric is kind of bending down away from the eye is where I'm going to put in my deepest shadows, almost in a long triangle shape. And then wherever the fabric kind of bends up, where it would be catching the most light, that's where I'm going to leave my highlights. So once I had that T9 laid in, I blended out that with the T7. And then I came in with a little bit of the T5, just eating a little bit farther into that white space each time. And then once I am ready for that highlight, I'll just fill everything in with the T3. And I forgot to color in her sleeve that is on the far side of her body, on the left, kind of tucked behind her. So I will have to go back and do that. And for that one, I just use the T7 and T5 because I figured it wouldn't be getting as much of a highlight over there. And I just went back and kind of smoothed over the edges to eliminate any harsh lines with that T3. I wanted her hat to match, so I'm going to go back to that darkest shade, the T9 now, and lay in my shadows where the artist has drawn the little creases in the hat. Since the hat is tipped up toward the left, the shadows are going to be more heavy on the right-hand side. Also on the brim, they're going to be more heavy on the right because the top is kind of hanging over it, so it wouldn't be getting as much light there. So once I have the T9 laid in, I'm blending out with the T7. I also put a little shadow right above and below the bow. And then I'm going to blend out with the T5. Again, just taking that color a little bit further, making sure to color over the edge of the previous shade to eliminate any harsh lines and make everything as nice and smooth as possible. And then I'll fill in any remaining space with the T3. And I actually wanted the underside of the hat to be in a different color. So for the underside of that hat, I decided to go with some purple shades. I went with some duller purples. I went with V22, V25, and V28. I think that makes sense since the underside of the hat is still very shadowed. So just use that V28 closest to the head, and then blend it out on either side with the V25 and then the V22. And I also wanted to give her some purple leggings, but I wanted them to be a little bit lighter so that you could see that they're kind of stretched over her skin. So I added in the V20, and for these I'm going to skip the V28. So I'm just starting with the V25 as the darkest, and I drew in some little kneecaps for her, blended out with the V22 and then the V20, and then I went back and added an extra little bit of that V25 to just darken up those shadows, and then did a second layer to blend everything out. Next, I wanted to bring in some burgundy reds. I went with R83, R85, and R89, and I'm going to give her some red boots. I recently finished reading a book called The Invisible Hour by Alice Hoffman, and there was some significance to red boots, which also reminded me of an older book by Alice Hoffman called Blackbird House, where there was a woman who was accused of being a witch, and she also had a pair of red boots. So I had to give my little witch some red boots as well. Then I colored in the bow on her hat to match, and I'm also going to do the little shawl that is wrapped around her neck. I did want to mention that this is a sneak peek for the Hello Bluebird new release, which is going live tonight when you're watching this, September 29th at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, which is 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I accidentally said it was in October in yesterday's video, but the release is actually in September. It is tonight when you're watching this, if it's the day that it goes live. I will also be posting an overview of the entire fall/Halloween release in just a little bit after this video, so definitely check that out if you want to make your shopping list in preparation for the new release tonight. So I'm moving on to the little lace trim under her dress and on the edge of her scarf, and I used E40, E41, and E42 for that, just to make it look a bit vintage. And then I'm going to move on to the broomstick. I'm using E55 and E57 for that, just the two shades because it is very, very thin. Started with the E57 on the bottom side and then blended out with the E55. And I did go back in and add a bit extra of that E57 to darken it up, and then just blended that out one more time. And then I'm going to keep those two shades and also add in Y26 and Y28 to do the straw part of the broom. And I'm just going to flick in those colors and try to get it to blend, but also keep a little bit of kind of streaks in there just to give it a more unique look and make it look, you know, like real straw, I guess. So I just kept blending over that until I was happy with how that was looking, and added a little bit of extra dark in there as well with that E57 once again. And then I'm going to move on to my kitty, and I'm going to use neutral grays for that, so it's a little bit different than the black of her dress and hat. I'm using N3, N5, and N7 to do a little black cat. But I didn't want to get too dark and lose all the adorable features, so instead of going with the N9, I just went straight to N7 as my darkest shade, laid in a bit of shadow with that, blended out with the N5, and then I brought the N3 in on the face, and that's when I realized I needed to go even a little bit lighter on the face, just so you could really see those little features. So I brought in N1 for that, and also used the N1 to color in the insides of the ears. And then I'm going to do my bats the same, so I'm just going back to the N7 for them, adding my shading on this one a little bit more on the right for his body, but even on his face, because his face is completely forward, but his body is slightly tilted toward the left. And then for the other one, I did my shading on the left-hand side because he's facing toward the right. So I blended out the N7 with the N5, just like I did with the kitty. And then I'm going to blend out with the N3 for most of the body. And I just save the N1 for the center of the face, a little bit on the chest area, the belly for the second guy. I also outlined the little parts of the wing where the bone structure is with the N3, and then just filled in with the N1. And I also colored in the feet with the N1 just to make those look a little bit different. And you can see that the rosy cheeks on the bats and the kitty kind of got lost. So I'm going to grab my R20 once again and add that back in, and also throw a little bit of that to the insides of their ears. Then for my pumpkins, I'm going to do all three of them the same. Usually I like to mix it up and do different shades of pumpkins, but since the coloring was quite long in this video already, I decided to simplify and just do one shade of pumpkins, and that's going to be YR12, YR14, and YR18. I think this is the most realistic combo for pumpkins because it has a little bit of a brownish, rusty undertone. It just looks a little bit more natural than like a brighter orange. So I started with the YR18 and outlined the edges and also any of the little lines that are indicating the grooves in the pumpkin, and then blended out with the YR14. And then I wanted to keep the area around the face nice and light with the YR12, not only because it's the most rounded, but I also want to do a little glowing inside, and so I wanted the center to be light to reflect that glow a little bit. So before I do that glow, I'm going to use YG95 and YG97 for the stems on the two pumpkins that have them. The bigger pumpkin is from the Spooky Text stamp set. And then the glow I'm going to do with Y11 and Y13. Just a tiny bit of that Y13 down low in the mouth and eyes, and then blending out with the Y11. And then I will use that T3 to go over the little ring on the end of the broom because I forgot to color that in earlier. And then I took a black Sakura glaze pen from Jelly Roll and just went over the eyes of all of my critters and my little witch to make them nice and bright and shiny. And then I trimmed these images out with their matching dies. So for the background, I'm taking the moon from the full moon die set and trimming that out of some masking paper. I'm using the Inkadinkado masking paper, but any masking paper will work. And I'm adhering that to a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock. I'm going to save that release paper because I can reuse this mask another time. And then I'm going to blend right over the mask using some squeeze lemonade to create a little bit of a glow around my moon. I like squeeze lemonade for this because it's really nice and soft, and I don't know, it just kind of works for that little bit of a glow that you want. It's not too dark. The next color I'm going to bring in is Shaded Lilac. I'm going to do a purple sky. I thought that would be something different. And I'm going to bring that in from all four corners. It's just a very light purple. I don't want to blend over the squeeze lemonade because the yellow and the purple together might get a little bit muddied, but I'm just going right up to it. So I'm just putting down a base layer of that color, and then I'm going to darken it up using Wilted Violet. This is quite a bit more vibrant, so I'm going to be a little bit careful where I add that, just mainly concentrating on the four corners. And then I will go back to my Wilted Violet to kind of blend that in and smooth over those transition areas, or at least that was my intent until I accidentally dipped my ink blending tool in the wrong ink pad. So it ended up going a bit darker than I intended, but that's okay. It still ended up looking nice. So next I'm going to bring in Villainous Potion, which is even darker, and once again I'm just concentrating that color on the edges and making sure that those are nice and bold and kind of creating a halo effect around that moon. So we have the dark edges and then that light center right around that area. So I'm going to work my way back now, blending that out, just smoothing over those transition areas. And once again, I accidentally dipped into the wrong ink pad, so it got a little bit dark. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to bring in my final shade, which is Black Soot, and just darken up those edges even further. This always makes things look really like a night sky to me. I really love adding a little bit of black soot on those edges to just darken things up and make it look almost spooky, which is perfect for this scene. And you can see that a lot of that squeeze lemonade got covered up, so I am going to go back in with that. I'm going to start right on that mask and then blend off the edges just to make sure that that color is prominent enough in there. Then I'm going to take some plain water and splatter this all over that background. Let that water react with those Distress Oxide inks for a minute and then lift that up with a paper towel. And I had one spot where that water was a little bit too much of a blob there, so I just went back over it with that squeezed lemonade, and you can barely even tell. And then I'm going to take some white paint. This is the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. And I'm going to add that to my block, mix it with the water that was already on that block, and then splatter that all over the background to look like stars. And then I'm going to take a bit of the black soot and mix that up with a little extra water and splatter that all over the background as well. I just think it adds a lot of texture and interest to that night sky. I'm using a super fine paintbrush this time to get very fine little dots. And then once that is mostly dry, I'm going to peel off that mask. You really should wait until it's completely dry, but I was impatient. So I'm going to peel off that mask, and you can see that beautiful bright white space from our moon. And I will save that mask and just tuck it in with that die set so I can use it anytime I want to create with that die again. And then I'm going to take some of that squeezed lemonade and just add it to the center of that moon so that we get a nice glow behind our witch once I add her to the scene. I also wanted to create some craters on the moon, so it wasn't quite so perfect. So I'm just taking some water again and splattering that right in the center over that moon. And this time I don't mind if I get some bigger droplets, so I switched to a bigger paintbrush, and then I'll let that react and then dab that up carefully. And I did that a couple of times just to really concentrate that water in the center and create more craters and just make it look nice and full there. Although in the end it's mostly covered up, so I probably could have skipped this step, but I do think it really adds to the overall effect. So I'll set that aside to dry completely, and in the meantime, I'm going to take the Winter Woods overlay and die cut that out of some Lawn Fawn black soot cardstock. And then I'll just pop all of the little pieces out between the branches of the trees. So yes, this is a winter die, but it's definitely usable for Halloween or fall cards. I think it works for a lot of different things. So before I layer that on top, I need to stamp my sentiment. So I'm taking 2 different sentiments actually from the Spooky Text stamp set and stamping those down together to create an extra long sentiment. So the first one is the Hey Ghoul Friend, and the second one says, May your treats be many and your tricks be few, which I think is really fun. Stamp that down twice with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and then I'm going to set that aside to dry. And in the meantime, I'll pop in my card base, which is Lawn Fawn Sugar Plum cardstock. And I'm just going to stamp on the inside using jet black ink, which is the same ink I used to stamp my sentiments, because I needed something dark on that darker purple cardstock. And I did Wishing You a Night Full of Frights and a Bag Full of Delights with another one of those pumpkins. So I've added some thin strips of foam tape to the back of that Winter Woods overlay die, and I'm just going to peel off those release papers. I only put it behind the thicker of the branches to give those some support, and I didn't bother with the thinner ones. And then I'm just going to line that up over the background and make sure that that is nice and straight on there. I had a little bit of trouble. I needed to adjust that foam tape because it was a little bit too thick and I could see it showing from the bottom. So I just fixed that and adjusted things until it was nice and straight. And I think that piece of Bristol was just a little bit larger than this die. I might not have cut it down perfectly. So I'm going to take a pair of scissors, my Cutter Bee scissors, and I'm just going to trim off the background piece, just a tiny sliver from 2 sides of that to make sure that it doesn't show on the edges. So I'm not cutting the black, I'm cutting the background that is behind the black just by tipping it so I could get back there. And then I'm going to take some Barely Art Precision craft glue and just glue this to the front of my card base, which is an A2 standard size card. Just squeezing those corners together to make sure that it's on there nice and straight. And then I can bring in my images. So I'm going to start with my little witch, since she's the star of the show here. She's also the largest image, and everything else in the scene is kind of going to revolve around her. I've added foam tape to the back of most of her, but I'm using liquid glue where her hat was going to overlap the branches that I popped up with foam tape. And I'm going to center her right above that sentiment over top of the moon. Then I'm going to take some of the little pumpkins and I am going to just add foam tape a little bit differently than I normally do because some of the parts are popped up with the background or the Winter Woods overlay. So I'm actually just adding little pieces of foam tape where those images are going to overlap into that space that's not already popped up. So I'm going to add the larger pumpkin over on the right and then the smaller 2 pumpkins over on the left. And just adding a little bit of liquid glue to any part that's going to overlap the black part and then just the foam tape over the purple. I'm also going to add in the bats to the sky, and because those thinner pieces of the trees are not popped up with foam tape, I wanted to add a little extra foam tape where those bats will go. So this one's going to go over on the left, kind of between the brim of her hat and the end of her broomstick. And then I also have another one that's going to go up a little bit higher on the right-hand side. So I'm just making sure that I have that foam tape where it needs to be to support this little guy the best. And then I'll add the liquid glue to anything that's going to touch the branches. And then the little kitty, originally I wanted him to be riding on the end of her broomstick, but I felt like it needed something down in that bottom right corner for balance. Because that bat was so high up, I felt like the bottom on the right also needed to have a little bit of something higher up. So I ended up adding the kitty to the top of the little pumpkin, which I think also looks really cute. Then I'm going to take some little tiny iridescent stars and add those to my Twiddler's Nook embellishment tray to make them very easy to pick up. And I'll add tiny little dabs of glue with my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue. And then I'll pick those up with my Studio Katia embellishment wand and just set those into those little dabs of glue. It's going to dry clear so you won't see any of the excess that's showing, but I'm trying to be very careful not to add too much glue. And I'm just doing a few stars at a time so that I can remember where I put them because they are super tiny. And it kind of blends in with that white splatter, so you might forget where you put it if you do too many at once. But I just added a few stars here and there. I decided to do one more down at the bottom underneath the sentiment. And because that tray has that little notch cut into it, it's super easy to just funnel everything back into the bag when I'm done with it. And then I just wanted to add a little extra glitter. So I'm taking my favorite Stardust Stickles and I'll add that to the bow on the witch's hat and also to her little shawl around her neck. And I decided to add it to her boots as well, so they have a little bit of magic dust on them. I also added it to the glowing parts of my two jack-o'-lanterns, and I got a little bit out of the line, so I just fixed that with my fingernail while that was still wet. And then I did add it to the underside of my bat's wings as well, just to have a little extra sparkle. And that is going to finish up this card, so I'll lift that up so you can see all of the little details with those sparkly stars and the stickles and give you another peek at the inside. So again, this Hello Bluebird Fall and Halloween release is going to be tonight, September 29th at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, which is 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time if you're in my time zone. I will be also posting an overview video of the entire new release in just a little bit after this video goes live, so be sure to check back for that. And definitely don't forget to check out the Hello Bluebird blog for even more inspiration from the design team and also some giveaways. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. All of the products will be listed and linked for you down below. And thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I really appreciate you guys. Have a great one. Bye-bye.